Hello friends, in today's video I'm going to be doing the end of the year tag, which is something I also did last year and had a lot of fun doing, primarily because the questions within this tag I think are quite fun and thought-provoking, and they lead me to discuss books that I normally wouldn't if it was just what are your best books, your top books of the year. And I think that also serves as a reminder that just because a book isn't in your top 10 or your top 5 or one of the best books you've ever read doesn't mean that it didn't still provide you some sort of thrill, nuance, a takeaway, some sort of interesting experience, right? Something that you can that makes it worth reading in the first place. So with all that rambling out of the way, I got my questions ready. Let's dig into this tag. The first question on this tag is, what was an overhyped book you read this year? And for me, that was The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann. Now, I want to be careful not to discredit or disparage this book too much because honestly, I do still think it's a great book. I do see how it's this microcosm of the European landscape at the time. I see how it's quite prophetic. More than anything, I think I read the wrong translation. I found a very neat hardcover copy, I think published in the 70s, and I read that version, read that translation this past summer with my book club, and I just found it to be incredibly dry, very just prosaic in the way that the language came across. Not in its entirety, but large swaths of it just felt very tedious and quite, I think soporific is the word I'm grasping for. And I know that the book is supposed to have that kind of almost sleep-like rhythm, and that it's really manipulating and constructing this sensation of being stuck in this sanatorium, and it's dealing with time. And I actually really liked those philosophical and almost metaphysical components to it. However, the book for me was overhyped, primarily because I just went into it with really high expectations. I think I'll give it another chance in a few years. It might be 10 years, but I want to give the Woods translation a read. That's what most people were telling me is what I should have read. But either way, I think coming back to it years down the line, I'll have more managed expectations, I'll have greater historical context, and it'll be a better experience for me. But again, I want to connect this to the question, not that it was a bad book, but an overhyped for me personally, just from what I was being told from friends, from commenters, people on Instagram, everything like that about The Magic Mountain. It was overhyped for me, unfortunately. The next question is, what's the longest book you read this year? And I've read quite a few books that exceed 800, even exceed 900 pages. But this answer is actually quite easy. It's War and Peace. I think depending on the edition you get, it's 1,000 to like 1,300 pages. I think my 2-volume Rosemary Edmonds translation is something like 1,300 pages. So War and Peace. The next question is, what is the best short story you've read this year? And with questions like this, I like to stretch them out a little bit so that I can give multiple recommendations, and that's what I'm going to do here. The first one is The Quilted Jacket by Vladimir Sorokin. Now, he's usually known for his just obscene, jarring, grotesque stories, and there's a few that come to mind that are like that I could recommend. But honestly, I'm going to recommend The Quilted Jacket, and that's because this is a story that I think is much more approachable for people. The allegory, if that's the right word, or it's more just a metaphor, I guess. The metaphor being constructed within the story, it just feels like one of his more brilliant themes, one of his more brilliant creations. And the story follows this man who's living in this squalid, crammed Soviet apartment with his entire family. And in the corner is this swollen, rotten, odious, distended quilted jacket, this multicolored jacket that is his grandfather's, that's just been around forever. And no matter how gross and how long the one sleeve gets, all the holes and how tattered it gets, the grandfather will not give up this quilted jacket. He says, no, no, no. All you young generations want to do is just throw it out, give up on it, buy something new and cheap. And the grandfather says it just needs a little bit of TLC. Just patch up this hole. There's nothing wrong with it. And what this symbolizes is the older generation's inability to let go of the illusion and the allure of the Soviet Union. all the propaganda, the promises, the empty, broken promises, and bloodshed of the Stalinist regime and the empty promises of Bolshevism and all of that. Basically, that is what's the old guard essentially is what's being embodied by the grandfather here and his refusal to give up this quilted jacket. And there's just a lot of brilliant symbolism and quite poetic writing within this story that I think makes it an easy recommendation to all of you, especially if you're a little bit put off or hesitant because of maybe what you've been told about Sorokin stories. I think this one is something that can be ubiquitously loved and enjoyed. Now, the other short story I have to mention is Kappa by Akutagawa. And this is about 80 pages, so it's kind of somewhere in between like a short story and novella in a way. But this is like a modern Japanese mythological Gulliver's Travels. In the way that you have this man who falls down a hole, winds up in Kappa land with these kind of amphibious humanoid type creatures, and that really play on a lot of the flaws of humanity. And so it's rich in symbolism, it's rich in satire, irony, a lot of mockery, of just the cynical ways of humanity and our certain customs and rules and how arbitrary all of it is. Of course, a lot of the satire plays on Japanese customs, beliefs, culture at the time that this was written, but I think that a lot of the jokes and mockery stretch to humanity overall, and also it's just a fantastical and very quirky read. The next question is, what is a new author you discovered this year? And this isn't the first year I heard of her or discovered her, but it is the first year I read any of her works, and that is Clarice Lispector. And I must shamefully admit that even though I absolutely adored the story that I read, which was The Hour of the Star, I didn't read any more of her works the rest of the year. I don't know exactly why that is. I was moving, my son was born, and also I just really struggled to find any of her works in person, and I try to avoid shopping online as much as I can. So I blame it on those things, but I do need to make a concerted effort to read more of her works next year because her prose is simply magnificent. It's poetic, lyrical, more than anything, it's economical. A lot of her books are quite short, yet they pack so much within them, and I just had such a strong impression off the writing. Talking about the first question about most hyped, she came to me with a lot of hype writing on her, from direct recommendations to my own interests, and lived up to the hype, lived up to the expectations, which is not always easy to do when they are, right up to the ceiling. So I need to be reading more Lispector next year. Now, this next answer will probably disappoint some of you, but I have to be honest, author that didn't work out for you this year. Vladimir Nabokov. Nabokov, I read Lolita, of course, his probably, not necessarily his best work, but his most popular, his most famous, infamous in a way, work. And on the one hand, I found it beautifully written, and I think that his prose he's clearly immensely talented. He's clearly a magnificent writer, and I will read more of his books down the line, but specifically the story of Lolita I found to be just tiring, dull, monotonous, and not just for the reasons of, the subject matter is uncomfortable, unsettling, disturbing, all of that. I'm sure that was part of it, but more so, the book is roughly, I think the edition I had was like 230 pages, and I felt like the first 80 pages were compelling, they were fresh, they were new. But then after that, the story for me got into a rut, and it just felt like we were on rewind for the next 80, 100, 150 pages. So for that reason, it just dragged for me and kind of put like a sour taste in my mouth from Nabokov. Plus, he talks a lot of shit about Dostoevsky and some other writers I love. But I can't hold personal grudges against him. And I'm sure he has, well-articulated reasons for disliking some of these authors. So anyway, I'll come back to Nabokov in the future, I promise. Switching gears, what is the happiest book you read this year? Now, this one will surprise you. A Man Called Uwe by Frederick Bachmann. I say surprise you because for those of you that have read it or know what it's about, it's an immensely sad book. It's a very sad book. But I'll say it was my happiest for a few reasons. One, it's laced with comedy. There's a lot of comedic writing in there. The first page literally had me laughing out loud at a few parts of it. My wife is like looking over me because she was the one who kind of pushed me. We did like a book swap, and that was the book I read. And I think I gave her the Master Margarita. But anyway, getting sidetracked here. So there's a lot of humor in it that will put a smile on your face, that will make you happy. But without spoiling the book, you know, there's a lot of heavy topics to it. There's a lot of grief and sorrow in the book. But I did find it, especially by the end, to be quite uplifting. You know, he has this community around him that really, I think, rallies, and it's a story that expresses more about love, community, and hope than it is something that is just exploring kind of the dark, morbid, and depressing areas of life, if I was to kind of justify why I think it was one of the more happy books. That and I rarely read books that are happy, broadly speaking, or that have happy endings. So it kind of makes it, honestly, a difficult question each year. Now, of course, the next question is, what is the saddest book you read this year? And that is The Birds by Tardier Vesas. Now, this book is sad in a way that slowly creeps up on you. The sadness grows with every little chapter. And it's told through the narrative eyes of a man with mental disabilities. And he's basically taken care of by his older sister. And there's a lot of sympathy and compassion that already happens within their relationship and in those early chapters, and the way that he's treated poorly or slightly mocked by those around him, and also even to himself. He's very critical and self-conscious in the way that he's perceived, or how he perceives his own limitations. And a lot of those limitations are shaped by his own sister or from others around him. And he just feels like he's not contributing, and he's kind of being this anchor on his sister's life. But towards the end of the novel, when, without again spoiling things, another figure comes in and kind of disturbs and interrupts the bond, the symbiosis between the siblings, or even the homeostasis of his entire ecosystem and environment, it becomes quite a heavy story, because it reveals the complexities of taking care of an ailing loved one, whether it is someone who has a disability from birth, or it's an ailing parent or spouse or friend or something like that. And for me, it kind of looked at the grayness within that inevitably within this virtuous, benevolent act of caring for someone, there is a sacrifice that becomes part and parcel with that. And there is this burden that the caretaker willingly and unwillingly and consciously and subconsciously takes on. And I think that, combined with the narrative perspective of someone who feels like they're creating the burden, or they feel hopeless, they feel in despair, they feel like part of themselves and this existence that they're comfortable with is being ripped from them. That made it a sad story for me. The next question is, what is the most frustrating book you read this year? And I'm going to have to keep this rant abbreviated. I'm going to have to keep it short, and that is dedicated to The School of Night by Karl Ove Knausgaard. Now, those of you on the channel know that I'm a Knausgaard fan. I'm currently reading Winter of his Seasons Quartet, so the second book within the quartet. I've read book 1 and 2 of Mein Kampf, and I have the rest of the series packed away to read at some point. So I figured, let me dip my toes into some of his fiction. I'm bound to like it, right? Well, I know that The School of Night is part of a larger series, Morningstar series, but it really is written as a standalone. There's some references to those other novels, but largely it can be read as a standalone. And this book was endlessly frustrating, not just because it has an insufferable, misogynistic, bigoted, narcissistic narrator. It has that. And that doesn't in and of itself make it frustrating or a bad book or anything like that. There's plenty of books with horrible characters, and I mean horrible as in like bad people or detestable characters that have great books. And honestly, I think it shows that, you know, these characters are evoking such strong emotions out of you. That's not why I didn't like this book. The problem is the characters are immensely one-dimensional. I mean, as flat and 2D as they can get. The plot line just drags and drags. There's major plot points and events that are just abandoned. The dialogue often feels lazy and rudimentary. And the parts that do work in this novel, I feel like, are underserved. It has potential, but it just becomes squandered. But I'm going to leave it there. I have much more to say, but I do have a formal review that will be published in the coming weeks. So if you want to see my full force criticism, be on the lookout for that. Next is a book you haven't stopped thinking about. That is The Recognitions by William Gaddis. This is something I talked about in my last video because it was on my best books of the year list, so I'll keep it fairly short. But this is a book that just contains so much that I don't think you can grasp everything on the first pass. Primarily because the style is so jarring, but also because it is such an encyclopedic novel that it's just endlessly referential. There's so many interpretations that you can take from different characters, from different scenes, that it's a bottomless well, is how I think of it. And the reason why it just continuously come on my mind is just because of the age we're in with artificial intelligence and art. Just more broadly, questions surrounding authenticity and originality are timeless questions, I think, in a lot of ways. And so that book just, I think it doesn't provide an answer to that question, but it provides a very compelling question or setting to kind of explore such a question. Next is Book You Thought You'd Love, but Didn't. Now this is going to pain many of you, particularly Matt from Colossum Books, who I spoke to a few days ago about this. And that is Moby Dick. This is a book that I really thought I would love, and I just didn't. Like The Magic Mountain, it might be a book that I come to years later with a lot more love, a lot more room in my heart for it. And I certainly respect the book. And the funny thing about it is, as I got closer to the month we were reading it in the book club, I got so excited. And so maybe I just had a little bit too much excitement and hype going into it. But then the first 150 pages floored me. Like I was like, wow, this book is awesome. It was just so riveting. But then once they set sail, everything went downhill for me. Unfortunately, everything, with the exception here or there, like the Whiteness of the Whale chapter is blissful. And there's a few others. And of course the ending is pretty great, but it's a long sail ride, you know? It's a long journey through that, and the encyclopedic parts where he's literally like interjecting whale anatomy, it just didn't really do it for me. But maybe in the future, we'll see. Next is a great question, and that is book with the most unique concept you read this year. I read a lot of experimental fiction this year, and so I have several answers to give you. The first being Schadenfreude, which I've talked about a few times on this channel. Many of you have probably heard about it. And it's not a book for everyone. It's actually a book for a very small select few of people. And it's kind of a research project of a book. However, just on a fictional plot line here, the idea that you are following this imprisoned individual whose thoughts are being converted to brain fluid, and this very book that you're reading is kind of being written and also erased and manipulated in real time. There's all sorts of anagrams and riddles and interjections within the book. You're being shot forwards and backwards chronologically within Germanic history. You're being injected within these Hieronymus Bosch paintings. There's just levels and layers and certainly endless, I think to a numbing level, references within the book that make it a book worth studying. It's not something, I don't know. I'll leave it there. I wrote a review on it. I've discussed it in multiple videos, so I'll leave it there. Another one that comes to mind is Needle's Eye by Myśliwski. Sorry, I can't do Polish names to save my life. But this book also features a very puzzling concept. And that is this narrative that seems to fold on itself or kind of loop in certain ways, where it opens with this elderly man falling on the stairs and dying. Not a spoiler there. It happens in the first few pages. But by the time you're kind of blending and seamlessly flowing between these different recollections and memories and dreams and honestly, different perspectives and narratives as well, it kind of begins to fuse who is who. Is the man that passed away the man from this childhood memory? Is it the man telling the story? Is he seeing himself kind of fall on the stairs? Like there's this, I don't know, it really constructs this interesting perspective, I think, of like time and the kind of unity of everything, not just of experience, unity of time, but also of identity. So there's a lot of things kind of being played at here. It's also beautifully written, which makes it an enjoyable experience. Another book that comes to mind is The Remembered Soldier, which was I don't remember if it won an award, if it was just long listed for an award. But The Remembered Soldier by Anya Danye, if I pronounced that correct, is quite a thrilling romantic book as well. It deals with a soldier who experienced a traumatic brain injury, doesn't remember anything about his own identity. His supposed wife comes and finds him in this mental asylum, takes him home, and is in this process of helping him rehabilitate and remember who he was, remember his 2 children, remember his wife. And throughout the whole story, you're witnessing the kind of trauma he experiences and the healing process and how brutal it is, not just for him, but for his spouse and the children and all of that, as he's trying to pick up the pieces and rebuild his life post World War I. But at the same time, the whole time you're questioning, is this woman really telling the truth? Is this really his wife? And you notice these kind of holes in the story, and it gets very, very fascinating. The only reason it hasn't really been, I haven't discussed it a ton on the channel, is because I think it could probably have been shrunk like 120 pages. It gets a little bit, it meanders a little bit here and there, but conceptually, it's a great, great book. And the last one I want to mention is The Life of Insects by Viktor Pelevin. That was a book that was gifted to me. I'm very grateful for it because it was my first exposure to Pelevin. And it's a very great work where he basically has all these, it's like a collection of short stories, but they're all kind of tied together under a larger story or theme. And each chapter features different insects, whether it's mosquitoes or flies or beetles and things like that. And he personifies the bugs as actual people, maybe something like Bug's Life, for those of you that watched that as kids growing up. And he pokes fun at all sorts of cultural or historical things. The dung beetles are continuously rolling, as you'd imagine, large balls of dung. They don't know why, but they keep peddling the same BS and passing it on to the younger generations. So there's a joke there. There's also a moth that is constantly seeking the light, but he doesn't know why, and it's like, you know, meaningless, and it also will kill him. All that, you kind of get the point. I think it's a very creative concept, and more so, it's done magnificently by Pelevin in the story. So I'd recommend that. Almost done here. The next one is book you read this year that you would reread. And that is the plays of Anton Chekhov. This little collection has all of his major ones, The Seagull, The Cherry Orchard, Three Sisters, Uncle Vanya, and a few others. And I loved this collection. I wrote a decent little blurb about it on Instagram after I finished it. But honestly, I need to revisit them. I'd like to try rereading them in the original. I don't know if my Russian is quite there or how long that would take, just because naturally reading in a foreign language will slow you down, something probably to like my 15-20% of my speed. But I think it would be a nice challenge and there'd be a clearer motivation, obviously, to read those stories because I love them so much through translation. But they're stories that just seem like, you know, you read it the first time and you're impressed. Wow. But they seem like stories that just continue to grow in profundity and further expand in their meaning and message the more you read them. And they're also quite short. They're very enjoyable. The characters are loud and vibrant, vivacious. So for those reasons, Chekhov is, I can't recommend him enough, and I do plan to come back to this collection. Next is Book You Wish You Got To this year, and that is Virgin Soil Upturned by Mikhail Sholokhov. And for those of you that don't know, In Quiet Flows the Dawn is one of my favorite books I've ever read. I've mentioned it on the channel several times, and this is essentially the sequel to it. In Quiet Flows the Dawn, every time I mention it on the channel, it gets complicated because someone makes the accurate but complex question that, oh, well, the English edition isn't the full edition. If the English edition is only 600 pages or something like 500, how come the full edition is 1,000? Like, there's something missing. And it's not that the edition in English is abridged, but just the way that it's published and split up, not even just in English from my understanding, but in other languages as well, it just gets a little bit tricky. I'm going to cut myself off there because I'm getting into the weeds. But point is, I loved In Quiet Flows the Dawn, and the idea of reading more of that sounds lovely. So I plan to read Virgin Soil Upturned. I bought these beautiful 2 volumes earlier this year and just never got around to them. I have them packed with me here in Virginia, but just haven't been able to squeeze them into the year. However, next year I put on my reading schedule for the book club. If you didn't know, it's somewhere on the channel, maybe a few videos back, I announced the reading schedule for the 2026 Active Mind Book Club. Link to join is down below. And I think I have it slated for October or November, and Quiet Flows the Dawn. So I'm going to reread it next year with the plan of reading those final volumes probably, immediately after, something like that. So it'll be worth the wait. So that is the book I didn't get to this year that I really wanted to. And the last question is, what will you prioritize in your 2025 reading year? Well, I don't have anything specific, but I will say just more new releases and fresh translations. That's something I did, I think, quite heavily the last quarter for sure of the year, but even kind of Q3 as well. And something I plan to do next year is to try and review at least 1 book a month. So really keeping an eye on these new releases from all these wonderful publishers. So that is something I would like to continue to do, is just seek out these new releases, contemporary authors, contemporary works, fresh translations. That's just something I would like to continue to do into the new year. So that's it for this video. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Your answers to these questions as well. Feel free to have at it down below. Like the video if you enjoyed it, subscribe for more content, and I will see you all in the next one.